Once again, my name is Linda Abraham, and I am the president of Accepted and the moderator for today's webinar. Welcome to the MCAT, what you actually need to study, to be presented by Clara Gillen of Next Step Test Prep. Probably the most anxiety-provoking part of the medical school application process is the MCAT. That's why we have invited an expert in MCAT prep to speak here today. We're going to be discussing how to approach the new sections of the MCAT, as well as other planning, time management, and study resource kinds of issues. Clara is going to provide an awesome overview, as well as very concrete suggestions. And just to keep you around, I mean, not that you should have any reason to want to leave, Accepted, or I will announce a free giveaway at the end of Clara's presentation. So again, stay tuned. Before we start, a few housekeeping items. Clara may ask a few questions during the presentation and ask you to raise your hand in response. You can do so by clicking on the hand icon, two icons underneath the horizontal orange arrow on your control panel. Please raise your hand or click on that icon when you see it. Okay, can you click on that icon? All right, yeah, you guys are getting it. Okay, good, perfect. As usual, we're looking forward to answering your questions, and we've set aside time for Q&A. So feel free to enter your questions in the question window, and we'll review the questions submitted and choose those that have the broadest application. If you don't have time for your specific question, we'll be providing several options for you to get answers at the end of the webinar. Now, just a bit about our presenter and Next Step Test Prep. Clara Gillen is the MCAT Content Director at Next Step Test Prep and has been teaching and tutoring for 5 years. She scored a 526 on her own MCAT and with perfect scores in the CARS and biochem sections. Her favorite part of test prep is finding alternative ways to explain tricky concepts. Clara also plays an important role in the development of Next Step's practice tests and other resources, where her top priority is making content as representative of the official exam as possible. In her spare time, she runs a Girl Scout troop in Los Angeles and loves watching movies. Next Step Test Prep, which is her employer, provides expert one-on-one tutoring for the major graduate and professional school entrance exams, as well as a brand new and very comprehensive online MCAT prep course. At the end of Clara's presentation, I will announce a free resource for applicants, but for now, Accepted is delighted to be hosting this webinar for Next Step. Clara, the floor, or should I say the mic and screen, are all yours. Now, do you want to, should I go into the polls now, or do you want to do them later on?
Let's do the polls now. I will share my screen and my webcam.
That's a good idea.
All right. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here.
Okay. And the first poll is, when are you planning to take the MCAT? Okay. Please select the option that is most likely. All right, we're getting a very good participation. Looks like this group is leaning towards taking it sooner than later, with 74% having voted. Can we get it over 80%? 5, 4, 3, 2. Anybody else? Almost there. 1.5, 1. Okay, I'm going to close it with 78% having voted. And let's share the results. So 58% plan to take it in the next 6 months. 28% plan to take it in the next 6 to 12 months, or about a year. 11% are taking it in more than a year from now. And 3% aren't sure if they're going to take it. All right. And the next poll that we wanted to ask you is, which of these science subjects would you guess is tested most on the MCAT? And please go ahead and share your views. All right, a lot of good participation here. It's almost a tie between biochem and biology. Reminds me of what I was watching last night, a little later than it is now. But anyways, with 80% having voted, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Let's close and share the poll. Biology is 40%, biochem is 48%, chemistry is 8%, organic is 5%. And Clara, are they pretty close to being right, or you
They
gonna?
are.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll go into that later, but good, you guys know your MCAT.
Okay. And then the next poll is, let's see. It's nice to learn about the audience a little bit before we get going. The next poll is, which MCAT section worries you the most? Okay. This we should get 100% participation on. I'm sure there's one that's worrying you. Okay. It's here. It's pretty. It's changing. It's pretty close. 80% having voted. 81%. 83%. 5%. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. With 80% having voted, this was a popular one. 44% are concerned about chemical and physical foundations. 40% are concerned about critical analysis and reasoning skills. 13% about biological and biochemical foundations, and 2% about psychology and sociological foundations. So I think that gives you an idea of kind of where our audience is at. And with that,
Absolutely.
I think, Clara, it's time for you to take it away.
Fantastic. Well, first of all, it's great to be here, and I'm very excited that you guys came out tonight to hear a little bit about the MCAT. It sounds like most of you are planning on taking the MCAT fairly soon, so you might know a little bit of this information already, but hopefully we can give you some specific tips that will help you throughout your own studies. So just to begin, for those of you who might not be as familiar with the exam, the question here is, well, what subjects are actually tested? And you might know this already, and they're the sections that you just saw in the poll, but the sections on the MCAT are chemical and physical foundations first, then critical analysis and reasoning skills, which we won't talk as much about today because critical analysis and reasoning skills is basically a verbal section, and you don't actually have to know any outside material for that section. Then there's biological and biochemical foundations, and last of all, psych and sociological foundations. So what's actually tested within these sections then? What do they actually have on them? Well, first of all, we have our chem and phys foundations, and as you might expect, the bulk of this is chemistry, general chemistry, and also physics. But what's interesting about the current MCAT, as opposed to the old MCAT, if you might be familiar with that exam, is other subjects are tested on the section as well. There's a significant amount of biochemistry, there's even some organic chemistry, and even a little bit of biology. So this is the first main point I would like to make tonight, which is just that there's a lot of overlap between current MCAT sections. You might see a passage that really looks biochemical or biological on this chem and physical foundation section, but mostly gen chem and physics. Then what about the biology section? Well, as you might guess, this section is clearly overwhelmingly mostly biology. Then there is also some biochemistry, just like that chem and phys foundations. There's a little bit of gen chem and a little bit of organic chem. So this is also different from the old MCAT. There's some organic chem and some gen chem actually in both of these sections. But as we can already start to see, biology is tested very heavily. Biology has been the bulk of this section and even a little bit of the previous section. So then last of all, what's on the psych and sociological foundation section? Well, again, as you might expect, mostly psychology. About half of that amount is in sociology, and then even some biology here. So you're going to see some biology across all these sections, of course, except for the cars section. And that's why those of you who said you thought biology was tested the most on the MCAT, you're correct. Biology is absolutely the focus of the current MCAT, and makes up a larger percentage of total exam questions than any other topic. The second is biochem, so those of you who pick biochem are close. And what we might get out of this too is if you're worried about organic chemistry, which many students are, or if you're worried about physics, those sections technically make up less of the MCAT, although you absolutely want to understand them, especially organic chemistry, as it can tie into some other topics as well. But they're not nearly as heavily tested as that bio and biochem. Now, just a quick overview. If your MCAT's a little bit further out and you're wondering what courses you need to take before the MCAT exam, or what courses you actually should take regardless of whether, you might hear that you need them. So what you definitely want to take before your MCAT, and this is really kind of absolutely if possible, it's 2 semesters of biology. So again, biology is very high yield on this test. 2 semesters of Gen Chem, 1 or 2 semesters of organic chem. 2 is technically recommended by the AAMC, but you can absolutely get away with 1 semester of organic chem, again, because organic chem is tested little on the MCAT. Then 2 semesters of physics. And of course, it's very important as you're taking these college courses to really pay attention to the fundamentals, because a lot of times students will take these courses and think, oh, they're going to be fine for the exam, but then they'll forget a lot of these fundamental concepts, or they'll get too wrapped up in the details. So try to get the most out of these classes as you're taking them. Now, what should you take if possible? So let's say you have a little bit of free time, and you're thinking, okay, what extra class should I take? Well, biochemistry, of course. And I get this question all the time, actually. Students will ask, well, do I need to take biochem before taking the MCAT? And the answer to that is technically no. We'll get into that later. But if possible, you definitely want to take 1 semester of biochem before you actually start preparing for the exam. Then psychology or sociology, preferably an introductory psych or an introductory sociology course, because then you'll learn a lot of the terms that you're going to see on the exam. But honestly, any psych or any sociology course, if that's your only option, is definitely a good thing, because you'll learn a lot about these experiments and methods and just this kind of way of thinking that you will see on the psych and sociology section. So then your question is, well, what if you can't fit these courses in, especially biochem or psych-soc? And the answer then is that's okay. It's okay. I've had probably about half of my students up until now actually have not taken biochemistry, or took it so long ago that they might not remember it. And that's perfectly fine. Then you can self-study, and you can just study this material on your own really as early as possible if you know you're not going to be able to take the course. And what I do advise in that case is don't self-study using, say, a college textbook, because I know a lot of students who kind of want to do that, take that approach. And really you want to be studying with actual MCAT prep materials, because for biochemistry, for example, a college biochemistry course will go into a lot more detail and a lot more depth than the MCAT actually will, and we'll get into that again later as well. So then just in terms of general other tips, let's say you've taken all of these and you're looking for another course, I always advise any class in which you do a lot of reading. So even if it's just, say, a Russian literature class, if you're reading, it's going to help you in all sections, including the cars, but also all the science sections, because the MCAT is a passage-based exam. The bulk of the questions that you'll see are associated with a passage that you have to read. So then other courses, if you can take, say, a course that you know really values reasoning, or a course in which you read a lot of scientific papers, that's also something that I highly advise. All right. So moving on to specifics, because of course this webinar is for the MCAT, what do you actually need to study? And of course we aren't going to get into all these individual topics tonight, but probably the 2 most common questions I get about what do I need to study for the MCAT are about biochemistry and psychology, so the 2 new topics to the exam. And for biochemistry, here, this is always a conundrum for students, because you can go into as much depth as you could ever want with biochemistry, and it can be intimidating. So as you see here, we see all of these pathways. We see the citric acid cycle and the pentose phosphate pathway, and they all interact and have all these common substrates and intermediates, and it can be terrifying. And so how do we actually make this something that we can, how do we know what to study and what to ignore or what to study less? Well, what you want to do is you want to focus on the big picture, because this is an MCAT secret, or maybe not so much of a secret if you've been studying already, but the MCAT very much values your knowledge of fundamentals. It is not a test that values memorizing little details. So the MCAT is also not a tricky exam. The MCAT is a test where if you understand the basics, it will get you a lot farther than if you try to memorize a lot of very individual specifics about these pathways. So how do we do this? Well, you want to pay special attention to certain things as you're studying, and we're going to get into detail about, how do you know what particular, if you're reading your book, for example, what's important and what isn't, what's likely to come up and what isn't. But as you're studying, no matter what, you always want to pay attention to general principles. So this is like, for example, when will this pathway be stimulated? When will this pathway be inhibited? More than these very specific details. Then also physiological function, of course. Why does this pathway exist? Knowing, for example, that glycolysis exists to break down glucose, and make certain products is a lot more valuable actually than knowing, say, all of the individual products or intermediates or enzymes in the pentose phosphate pathway. Now, and this is huge actually, this will be a common theme throughout tonight's webinar, but absolutely pay attention to parts of biochemistry that you see a connection with other subject matter, in particular other MCAT subject matter. Because as we saw before, these sections overlap a lot. There's going to be some biology in every section, and there's going to be some chemistry in multiple sections. So if you see an aspect of biochemistry and you say, oh, that really relates to this other chemistry topic, for example, they're much more likely to ask about that because they can tie both of those topics into perhaps the same passage. So, what are some examples? Well, amino acids, probably the most heavily tested topic in all of biochem, actually. Pretty famous for being tested very often. Maybe 10 questions per test might be about amino acids. Well, amino acids are tested so often because they relate to biochem, they relate to a lot of these pathways, but they also relate to acid-base chemistry, titrations, lab techniques, and so they have a multitude of different questions they could ask about this topic. Other examples, carbohydrates. So for example, if you see a pathway uses a particular carbohydrate, then that might be something you want to pay more attention to because carbohydrates are a high-yield topic in organic chem. Then stereochemistry, like for example isomers. So let's say you're studying a pathway that has 10 steps in it, and you want to memorize all of these steps and all their intermediates and enzymes, but one of these particular steps involves the conversion of one isomer to another. Well, maybe that step is going to be tested more often than the other steps because now they have another way they can ask about it. They can ask about that step in an organic chemistry sense because isomers, of course, are a very big part of organic chemistry if you're familiar with that topic and more. But just keep this in mind as you're studying. If you see a random pathway and you can't see how it relates to anything in Gen Chem or anything in biology, which is rare, but if you see that, it's much, much more unlikely to be tested than something that has a lot of overlap. Now, just a little bit of a continuation on this. It can help to ask yourself questions as you go. The very last thing you want to do when you're studying biochemistry is try to just memorize all of the information on the page because it makes it very difficult to retain information, and then it's also not placing more emphasis on what's important and what's not important. So, for example, let's take a look at this pathway. So, this is glycolysis. It's 10 steps. And it looks a little bit intimidating. And again, like sometimes students will just sit down and memorize every enzyme of one of these that catalyzes one of these 10 steps. And then it's very likely they're going to just forget them. So what do? Well, you can say, okay, ask yourselves questions like, how does structure relate to function? Is there something that happens with cyclic carbohydrates, for example, that doesn't happen with linear ones? Then if you see a cyclic carbohydrate in any other pathway, you can say, oh, I know what probably happens to that. Then, of course, what does each pathway do? What's the purpose is very important. Many questions will just be based on that and won't even go into detail. Then what are the net inputs and outputs of each pathway? So here, of course, we see glycolysis begins with glucose and ends with pyruvate, technically 2 molecules of pyruvate. And there are other products and other reactants, but you absolutely want to know, okay, how many of each of these is produced per molecule of glucose, just in general, and things like that, and keep that in mind more so than these tiny details. Now what else? Well, are there any especially important steps? So whenever I review a biochemical pathway, I never want to treat all of the steps like they're equally important, even though of course they are in reality. Once, step 1 has to occur for step 2 to occur. But on the MCAT, certain steps of these processes are going to be asked about often, and certain ones are going to be virtually never asked about. So going back to this example of glycolysis, here step 1 and step 3, for example, if we remember, oh, well, if you actually look here, you see in both of those steps, we're adding this phosphate to our glucose. And so that's something those steps have in common. So just from knowing that, you can say, okay, probably these are actually the steps in which ATP is incorporated because it's a source of phosphate. If you know that kinase enzymes catalyze reactions in which phosphates are added, then you know automatically, oh, it's some kind of kinase that catalyzes these steps. And of course, if ATP is used, these steps are probably important, or at least stand out in a particular way. And then steps 7 and 10, end up being steps where ATP is produced. So you can tie steps together. It makes it much, much easier to remember what's going on as opposed to just trying to memorize step 1 does this, step 2 does this, etc. And of course, don't get caught up in tiny details. This is huge. If you've already started to study, you might have run into the problem where you're reading a biochem chapter and going through it takes you like 5 hours or 4 hours and you're taking very detailed notes. And that's fine, but the problem is your content review is going to take you months, and you might not have that kind of time, or you might want to devote more of your time to strategy and passage practice. And if that's true, just basically say, okay, you're going to write down, say 5 or 10 most important parts of each page, and then when you go and take practice exams, see if what you wrote down really corresponded to what was tested, and you can constantly update your notes as you go. So, moving on, psych and sociology. And this I brought up today just because the psych and soc section, even though it doesn't seem like you guys are too worried about it, which is generally true, it's the most random section on the current MCAT. And by random, I mean they can ask about tiny little details, and they do often. So of course, that kind of section is more difficult to predict, oh, what will they ask about? Because there are so many details that are part of psych and sociology. So everything on the AAMC outline is fair game. So if you've taken a look at the AAMC outline, I highly advise it. It's on the AAMC website, and it lists really everything that will be tested on the exam. And of course, it's not perfect. Some of these things that are listed on the outline might be broad, and you might have to do a little digging into the topic yourself. But what do you want to focus most on? Again, what do you really want to study? Well, a few things. So first of all, large topics like memory and bias and discrimination. So these are the topics, if you look in your prep books, memory as a concept might have, say, 30 terms associated with it. And in that case, you can say, okay, there's just so much they could ask about with regard to memory. You want to understand this concept inside and out. And then you can figure out how all these terms tie together, and you're going to be more likely to remember them. Now, also sociology in general. And this people always ask me about because, as we've seen, sociology isn't tested as much as psych. It actually only makes up about half the questions that psych does. But if you look at a typical prep book, you'll see that sociology is generally has less information. There's less information you actually need to know for sociology than there is for psych. And so because of that, you can get those 30% of questions, or you can get that material down disproportionately quickly. And sociology has in general fewer terms that you need to know, so I highly advise being familiar with sociology really as soon as you can. Now, here's another thing, a tip that I tell all of my students, is you want to be familiar with any concept that relates to a famous psych experiment. And actually, what I advise for all of you to do if you're preparing for the test is at least once every week, maybe more, look up a list of the top, say, 50 most well-known psych experiments. And you'll get things like this, the Stanford Prison Experiment, Milgram's Experiment, and just read about them. So read about, say, 4 or 5 of these experiments per day. And the reasons for this are twofold. So first of all, you might see some of these terms and actually be able to tie them into real life. And second of all, the MCAT test writers don't get their passages out of nowhere. So they get many of their passages they're going to write based on famous experiments. And so there's a very good chance you're getting kind of insider look into something that you might see in passage form, and then it'll help speed up your answers. It'll give you that additional insight. So definitely advise that. Then last of all, experimental design. So this is huge. So basically things like, oh, what are your independent and dependent variables? What kind of factors could confound an experiment or basically make the results less reliable? So you absolutely want to be familiar with this because a good knowledge of experimental design will help you on all the science sections, mainly psych, but also bio and even chem and phys. So definitely have that topic down. Now, what should you not worry as much about? Well, as we've seen, psych, they could test anything. So I can't tell you, oh, you definitely don't have to know this topic, for example. But students always ask me about a couple of things. And one is parts of the brain. So do you need to know every single little part of the brain? And sure, maybe if you have infinite time, you can do that. But the parts of the brain that are going to be tested by far the most often, just like we saw in biochem, are the parts of the brain that overlap with something else. So for example, my favorite example is always the pons. So the pons, if you might see it on your diagram of the brain in one of your prep books, but you're not going to see the pons mentioned really anywhere else in the book because it doesn't relate very heavily to any other MCAT psych topic. So it's unlikely that a question will ask about the pons. However, something like the reticular formation, maybe it relates very heavily to sleep. Sleep is an MCAT topic, so that's much more likely to be tested. So I always tell students, as you're going through your psych books, pay attention to your diagrams of the brain, get an idea of the big, like the lobes, things like the cerebellum, these larger areas, and then as you go through the rest of your prep, whenever you see a part of the brain mentioned, then you can say, okay, that's a part that's going to be more likely to be tested because, say, it relates to speech, for example, or something like that. And then you can go back and enhance your notes and be like, okay, this is probably going to be tested more often than the pons. Now, what else? Well, don't worry as much about very specific parts of the eye and the ear. So if you've already started studying, you know that sensations, so sensory, like hearing and vision, and smell and things like that can be tested on the exam, but many prep books have these extremely detailed diagrams of the eye with maybe 20 or 30 different parts, and then all these diagrams of the ear. And the truth is, the MCAT is not an anatomy test, and this applies in bio as well. Hey, you're not going to need to know, say, all the names for the regions of the stomach or something like that. It just is not that kind of exam because the MCAT values knowledge of just these overarching principles. So very specific parts of the eye and the ear, those are ones that I would generally leave aside, say, okay, they're far less likely to be tested. Then if you see them on a practice test, for example, you might say, oh, there it did come up on a test, maybe I'll write it down and remember it. But you're not going to obsess over it when it's so low yield and when you're studying originally. Now, I use the word low yield there, and people always ask about high yield MCAT topics, and high yield MCAT topics are the ones that are more likely to be tested than others. And every MCAT is different, and this is something that I kind of ties into that very beginning of this presentation where we said, oh, the chem phys section is 30% chemistry, 25% physics. That's not always the case. It's very close. The AMC will stick to their percentages, but you certainly could on your MCAT see an MCAT that's more heavy in chemistry than you'd expect, or a little bit more heavy in physics than you'd expect. And so there's a chance maybe none of these high yield topics will come up on your test. It's a low chance though. And yeah, as we said, some topics are more likely to come up than others. Now, why? Because if you know why the MCAT test makers like to test certain topics, then as you're studying, you'll always be able to predict, oh, this is probably important, this might not be as important. And two main reasons. So one is if a topic relates heavily to medicine or to the human body, it's going to be more likely to come up for the simple reason that almost every passage that you see on the MCAT, especially in the bio section and even the chem phys as well, is going to relate to the human body. The old MCAT would have passages where, say, there was just like a pulley and someone was lifting up a box, and that's a lot less common now. It's more likely that they're going to ask about some sort of medication or something like that. So if you see, for example, the blood buffer system, well, that's very relevant to the human body. You could see a passage about that. In fact, it's very common. So what's the other reason? Well, the other reason is they connect multiple topics or science subjects. So again, we see this overlap is very important, and that's important throughout the entire MCAT. If you see a topic that relates to biology and biochem and gen chem, that's so much more likely to be tested than, say, a little topic that's just a gen chem topic that you can't even think how it could relate to these other concepts. So the question people always have, of course, is what are the high yield MCAT topics? And of course, again, you never know. So maybe your test will not have any questions from one of these topics at all. But it's very likely if you get these topics down, that'll cover quite a few of your MCAT questions. So for physics, what's important? Well, what would you predict would be important for physics? So fluids relate heavily to the cardiovascular system. They could ask infinite questions about blood vessels, for example. And so fluids are very high yield. Electrostatics and circuits, they could easily turn that into a question about, say, neurons or the heart, the electrical activity in the heart. Then light and optics and sound, because of course vision and hearing. So we can very much predict that those will be tested a lot. Now what will be tested less? Something like translational motion. And of course, you'll probably see maybe 3 questions from that category per MCAT, but it's not nearly as likely that they'll ask about something like velocity or something like that you can't directly relate to the body quite as easily. Now, Gen Chem. So Gen Chem, acids and bases is my favorite example of a high-yield topic. It's a classic high-yield topic. And the reason for that is because, so acids and bases, of course, are Gen Chem topic, but they also relate to biochem, so amino acids follow the rules of acid-base chemistry. And then they also relate to organic chem because, say, molecular structure, certain aspects of a molecule make an acid stronger or weaker. And then even lab techniques, a lot of lab techniques rely on acid-base chemistry. So acids and bases, there's just such a variety of ways they could ask about this topic. And because of that, they do. They ask about it often. Now, solubility has always been important, but now they can relate it to, say, the activity of a drug, a medication in the body. And next, periodic trends. And this actually is something that I wanted to go into a little bit more depth with, because one mistake I see students making all the time is they don't value their very basic chemistry, and even to an extent their very basic physics enough. So they're like, oh, periodic trends and stoichiometry, the periodic table and topics like that. They're things you learn maybe even in high school or early in college, and they seem easy. And we're like, okay, well, the MCAT's not an easy exam, so I'm going to focus all my energy on things like electrochem, things that are difficult. But the MCAT actually will have a surprising number of questions about very basic, just chemical properties that are very, quick to learn. And so it's extremely important to get those fundamentals down. So I always advise people to learn about periodic trends and like atoms and molecules. Get those basics down in the beginning. So next, electrochem. Again, just another topic that can relate heavily to the body, and it is tested often. So moving on, biology. Biology, again, just a vast variety of things they could ask, but on the new MCAT, the new MCAT is emphasizing things like cell biology and molecular genetics more than it's emphasizing the body. And of course, you'll still see maybe even like 8 questions about body systems in a particular section. But it's not, a lot of times students make the mistake of thinking these body systems are everything on the MCAT. And in reality, things like DNA, RNA, just molecular genetics, transcription, translation might cover, say, 10 questions on a section, which is just as many as all the body systems maybe combined. So you definitely want to be familiar with those. Membrane transport is always a big one. Seems a little random, but things like passive and active transport is just very important to understand. And of all the body systems, so I wanted to list one here. Of all the body systems, I'd say historically the endocrine system has been the most important, and that's hormones, if you're not familiar. So definitely you want to get that down. They can ask a lot of very, have a lot of very convoluted passages about interactions between hormones, say. And biochem. So biochem, again, amino acids. Amino acids are huge, and amino acids are new on this current MCAT. They were not on the old MCAT, the prior to 2015 MCAT. And amino acids are one of those funny topics where if you understand them, many of these questions will be easy, or will seem at least somewhat easy. If you aren't familiar with them, these questions will be flat out impossible. You'll have to basically be reduced to guessing. So that's an extremely important topic to understand. Then enzyme kinetics, glycolysis, and analytic techniques like chromatography are all very important. And just in general, just to point out, by the way, before we move on to organic chem and its topics, what I always tell my students is the passages on the MCAT will cover topics that seem to range far outside of what you know. So it's very often, especially in this new MCAT, people get very intimidated if I say bio or chem phys. When they open up a passage and it's all about the CRISPR system, or it's about something very some random disease. And the truth is, on the current MCAT, the test makers want to confuse you and they want to intimidate you. So they want you to start reading this passage and be like, oh no, I don't understand what's going on. They want you to slow down, try to read every sentence very carefully. That's not what you want to do. Basically, going into the MCAT, if you understand these topics, these basic fundamentals, the things that you would see in a prep book, then that's what you're going to be asked about. they're just going to use this maybe convoluted passage to try to hide that, try to obscure this familiar topic that they're asking about. So as you read passages, I always advise my students, pay attention to what's familiar, not what's unfamiliar. So if you see them briefly mention some amino acid in a passage that's otherwise about something very complicated, pay attention to that amino acid. That's what they're probably going to test. So finally, organic chem. Again, not quite as high yield necessarily as these other topics, but there are some aspects of organic chem you want to be very familiar with. So functional groups, very simple and easy to learn. Isomers and stereochemistry, again, we saw how that could tie into biochem. And then biological molecules, of course, and lab techniques. And this is a big one, just to mention very quickly. Lab techniques are one of those things that almost ties together the whole MCAT in a way. So by lab techniques, I mean things like you would do in an organic chem lab, like distillation and extraction. And I run into a lot of students who haven't taken organic chem lab or who took it a long time ago and don't remember that clearly. And if that's you, you definitely want to do a review of these techniques, what they're used for, like do they separate molecules based on some criteria, how do you do them, because it's just extremely important. They can test practically anything in organic chem by relating it to a lab technique. Same with the analytic techniques that I've listed in biochem, which are things that are more usually based on proteins, so things like isoelectric focusing, things like that. Those are still lab techniques, and they could still easily ask you about any concept practically in relation to a technique. All right, so those are the high-yield MCAT topics. And just moving on really quickly, I did want to tell you about the resources that my company has, just very rapidly. And basically we have a lot of options, and you might already have your prep materials. You might already know exactly what you're going to do to prepare for the MCAT, and everyone is different. So of course I've seen students excel using practically any method. But we have a lot of options if you're interested, including for people who self-study. We have materials. We have an all-inclusive MCAT class that we actually just produced that we're very proud of, and we also offer private tutoring. So just briefly, this online class is probably the part of our prep that I am most excited about. And it includes a massive amount of resources, like 11 books, 12, actually now 13 full-length tests, because the AAMC actually just released a new practice test that they previously only had 2, and now they have 3, and those are included. And then over 10,000 practice questions. So what are some specifics of this course that I think are especially cool? Well, one is that it is customized study plan, and what I always tell students is you can spend your time studying or you can spend your time planning, but it's extremely difficult to spend your time doing both. And what I mean by that is if you have to decide, oh, every morning, what am I going to do today? And it takes you, say, half an hour to even figure that out, and you're going to be second guessing yourself throughout the day, thinking, oh, like, what am I supposed to be? Am I studying the right thing? Am I being efficient? So it's nice to have a study plan, although you can always, of course, make your own. But the way this works for our MCAT course is you put in your start date, you put in your test date, you answer a couple of quick questions, and it'll generate a plan for you. So, of course, we have a small team of instructors. You can read more about this if you're interested on our website, but the same 5 instructors teach all aspects of the course, so you can get a little bit familiar with their teaching styles, and they're all experienced MCAT veterans. And then also, so the way the course works is it's all video, so it's on demand. So basically you can watch these videos whenever you want. But then of course that leaves the question, well, how can I actually ask the teacher a question? And we offer 10 hours a week of in-person small group office, or online small group office hours where you can actually talk to the instructor directly. And usually these have been, very small groups, say even 5 to 10 students. So you get almost your own little mini specified session that's individualized to you. Then of course we like to provide this as inexpensively as possible. So the same resources as competitors but cheaper. Then of course if you're self-studying, we offer 10 full-length practice exams, a question bank, and a whole set of books. And of course this testing platform that mirrors the AAMC as much as possible. Then of course, etc. And then finally, one-on-one tutoring. I think students are kind of split. Some students really excel when they work with a tutor. Some students don't need, don't need a tutor as much because they can kind of direct their own prep. But if you ever do want, you know, your own actual consultant, someone you can speak to pretty much all the time about, ask any of your questions, that might be an option that works best for you. So that is what I have for now. Now, I am very happy to answer any questions that you guys have about the exam or about what we talked about today.
Okay, great. This is Linda. I also want to chat to you. Alicia McNeese Nimonkar, one of the Accepted's consultants, actually reviewed the new online course from Next Step Test Prep, and I'm chatting you the link to that. And we also have a page on Accepted, rather on Next Step Test Prep, specifically if you're more interested in the individual tutoring. So those are two resources, and obviously you have the resources that Clara listed on the screen there also. So Clara, I want to thank you for a great webinar. I think you want to have a show of hands. How many found this webinar to be helpful? Raise your hand if you found, oh, the hands are just flying up.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, so that's great. Oh, yeah, very, very helpful. Okay, great. Now let's get to some questions here. This is from, and again, I apologize for mispronouncing anybody's name. What type of reading should we acquaint ourselves with?
Great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good question. So you hear a lot of different things, a lot of people advising different things in terms of reading. So one thing that many people advise, and I personally advise as well, is reading scientific journal articles. And so basically what I tell most of my students to do is, say, once a week or twice a week, try to get through a couple of scientific journal articles. You can go to a lot of open access journals and find these articles, and they're going to be extremely dense. And basically what you want to do is try to actually work your way through the entire article, figuring out what the scientists are saying, how these things interact with each other. And that reading will be more difficult than the average MCAT passage you'll see. So the average MCAT passage many of them are adapted from scientific papers, so it'll be similar. But a lot of times scientific journal articles will have maybe 10 different proteins or 20 different proteins that are all interacting. And so that's very good practice to try to make sense of that. Then in addition, sometimes people will recommend like the Economist and Scientific American. And what I like to say, though, is that any reading you do will be helpful. Try to read whenever you can. So every day, if possible, read something. And if in doubt, just get a hold of a book that has a lot of MCAT passages and just read an MCAT passage and get acquainted with that style. And then once a week, maybe on your day off, read something that you enjoy. So even like a novel, because the more reading you do in general, by far the better your CARS score will get, CARS being the verbal section, and that will improve your other sections as well.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I'm not a test prep. I'll actually let you see me too here. Or maybe I won't because it doesn't seem like it's working. But all right, so you won't see me. It's fine. The reading is one of the just constant reading, whether it's good writing, though. I'm not talking about dime novels, will definitely improve your reading comprehension in any field. And obviously for the MCAT, you're going to want to also do a certain amount of scientific reading. All right, before I get to more questions, and we have quite a few really, really good questions, I had promised you at the beginning that I was going to tell you about a gift, and I will. Two things, actually, I want to tell you that are coming up at Accepted. One is something that you can download for free. And again, I'm going to chat you the link to it. It's called Navigate the Med School Maze, 12 Tips from Start to Acceptance. And this is a free guide that you can just download. Okay, so here you go. And here's the link for that. Just give me 1 second. And the second thing is I wanted to tell you about an upcoming webinar at Accepted that Alicia McNeese Nimonkar will be delivering. It will be in December, and it will be Get Accepted to Medical School in 2018. Basically, tips, structure, framework that will increase your chances of medical school in 2018. So just watch your email for that and Accepted's blog. Okay, so let's go back to the questions that have been posed. Morgan has an interesting one. and I'm not sure if Morgan is a man or a woman's name, but Morgan's question is, I used the Kaplan prep program and I was doing great on the Kaplan practice tests. However, when I took the real MCAT, my score dropped like crazy. Even when I took the AAMC practice test that came with the Kaplan prep, my score dropped 7 points from what I was making on the Kaplan practice test. The real MCAT also seemed really different than anything I had ever seen on any practice test. What can be said about this? I don't know if I should focus more on AAMC practice tests or what, but what advice do you have for me in this case? I don't even know what I'm trying to ask, but please help. Thank you. Sounds
Great question.
frustrating. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it is very frustrating, and I actually just saw a similar question online the other day, and it happens. So the thing is that all test prep companies try to make their tests as representative of the exam as possible, but just due to the fact that, we all generally are written by, say, a small staff of people, certain tests can have a certain feel to them, and the problem with that is usually they are representative. And Kaplan tests, for example, I think are generally fairly representative, even a little bit difficult. But occasionally students will really excel at one company's tests, and just for certain, maybe you just, the way they're worded, you happen to understand better. Maybe you practice entirely with Kaplan materials, and so the content they ask about is more familiar. And so then you go and take the real exam and your score goes down, and it's extremely frustrating. And the way to combat this, there's a few different things you can do. So one is, if you haven't already used certain AAMC materials, I would absolutely incorporate them, and in particular the AAMC section bank. So I don't know how many of you have actually tried using the section bank. The AAMC has a lot of different resources, but the section bank is by far the closest to what the actual test is now. It's entirely written for the new MCAT, unlike maybe some of their other materials. So and the section bank has, like dozens and dozens of passages. So what you can do is, even if you're prepping with, say, only Kaplan, you can throw in like 4 or 5 section bank passages every few days, and then okay, you're kind of grounding yourself in AAMC material. And then another thing you can do is switch it up, and this is something I advise for everybody, is no matter what, try to not take only one company's tests. And you can do this actually without spending really any extra money. Seeing that practically every company offers at least one free exam. So we offer actually a free half-length diagnostic and then a free full-length test. And so let's say you're taking mainly Kaplan exams, try to say, okay, maybe take a next step or take a Princeton review exam just 1 week instead of a Kaplan one, and that way you can see, oh, is your score way off? Is it very different? And then if so, you want to analyze that exam extremely carefully and say, okay, why did I do worse? Or maybe even better. And then you can get an idea, okay, this is what maybe Kaplan tests aren't providing me with that I need. So absolutely that. But AAMC material can never hurt. There is actually a lot of it out there now. And now, again, they have a second scored test, so 3 tests in total. So absolutely, I advise taking those.
Okay, great. Another excellent question from Samantha. How far in advance do you recommend studying if we're planning for a mid-June MCAT? And I guess the question really is how far in advance should they start?
Right. It depends on the student. So I'd say on average, most of my students start 3 to 4 months before they plan on taking the test. And that usually works well, because then you can have, say, one and a half, maybe even 2 months of content review, and then the rest of the time on strategy and full-length practice and stuff like that. So 3 to 4 months is probably typical. So if you're thinking about a June exam, say like February, you would start. But it does depend on the situation, because some students have unlimited free time. Say like people who are taking an exam in the summer usually end up with more free time leading up to their test. But then some students work full-time or go to college full-time. And of course then the issue is, well, maybe if you only have like 2 hours a day to study for the test, you certainly can still excel in it, but you're probably going to need maybe closer to 5 or 6 months. And I am always a fan of, say, if you need to take longer, take longer. If you need to postpone your exam and you don't feel ready, then do that, because it's better than taking the test when you're not fully prepared for it.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Let's see. There's another really good question that I saw and I wanted to share. Okay, Fareha asks, would logic or critical thinking general education classes be helpful for the CARS section?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, if that option is available to you, then most certainly I would advise it. The thing about CARS is entirely based on, how well can you understand what you're reading, and make, pretty pretty, I wouldn't say basic, but make like, you know, the logical conclusion from that argument. So the car section isn't all about, oh, reading something and then speculating. It's about what did I read, what did it say, and what's the very logical conclusion of that. So yeah, if you can take any course that values critical thinking, whether it's actually specifically a critical thinking course or even if it's a different subject, like, you know, I mentioned Russian literature. I actually myself took a Russian literature course that was very focused on critical thinking, and I found it enormously helpful. So yeah, I definitely would advise that if possible.
Okay, great. Next question. Um, are the Next Step strategy and practice books adequate for practicing all pertinent topics, or should they be supplemented with other practice books? And this is from Kent. Thank you.
Yeah, no, great question.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing about the strategy and practice books are great, and the way we set them up is, so basically if you're not familiar with them, for the science subjects, for the science sections, each S&P book has 4 full sections. So say the psych section has 4 full psych sections in it. And we set them up to be balanced. So basically each of those books will be balanced in the same way that say an AAMC exam would have been. So we won't just, you know, have a bunch of passages on, say, the endocrine system. So yeah, you should encounter virtually all the topics that you would see on an actual MCAT in the S&P books. However, the thing is, the strategy and practice books are just practice, so they're just passages and questions. So if you feel like you need content review, I would definitely advise supplementing with you know, a content review set, because if you say, oh, I missed this question about the kidney, I want to go read about the kidney, then the S&P books they will not have that just straight up science information. And I also always do advise in terms of like, are those books enough? Then certainly yes, but you want to have access to full-length practice tests also, and preferably online things. So we have, you know, 10 online full-length practice tests. You can kind of break up into sections, some of them if you want. But it is important to get practice that feels like the test in that kind of online interface setting.
Okay. We have a question here from Serb, and I suspect this is something that's covered a lot in the course. So I'm not sure that you can give a 1 or 2 minute response. But the question is, how should they read tricky questions in the MCAT?
Well, yeah, so that's really, I really appreciate that question. And yeah, and the course does cover this, so we cover, you know, a lot of just strategies for all question types. And the thing is that the MCAT is not a tricky exam. So the thing is, what you'll see often is you'll see long questions sometimes. You'll see questions where you're not entirely sure what they're asking. Like you're not sure maybe if they're asking about a protein like inhibiting something or stimulating something. But you usually won't see outright trick questions. So the most important thing by far is understanding what the question's asking. So you basically just to clarify, like, you won't see a question where they're intending to lure you into a wrong answer as often as people tend to think. Now the problem is, you know, you want to know what this question is asking, and so what I always advise is if you see a question, you're not sure what it's asking or it's a little bit confusing, try to dumb it down. So before you even look at the answer choices, reword the question in as simple and almost like, you know, really dumbed down language as possible, and then see if that makes a little bit more sense. And do that before you even move on to the answer choices, because too often people will read the question, not be entirely sure what it's asking, then move on to the answers, and then, you know, and then get them wrong. But if in doubt, also, if you have no clue what a question is asking, or you think it's extremely tricky, then you can look at the answer choices and say, okay, you know, maybe 3 of them have something in common, 3 of them kind of mean the same thing, and 1 of them is different. Then that one answer choice that's different is likely to be the correct answer, because there can't be 3 correct answers for one question.
Okay. I'm all right. Here's a question. There's some very good questions here, and some rather poignant ones. Rima is asking, do you think the MCAT is a large part of what medical schools look at?
Absolutely. Yeah. No, definitely. Like, practically, I mean, there are some medical schools that don't emphasize it, but in the vast majority, the MCAT is MCAT and GPA. And of course, you know, those aren't the only components of an application. But MCAT score is huge, and actually it's especially important if other aspects of your application are not as strong. So
Right.
say your GPA isn't as high, then you definitely want a very, you know, as high of an MCAT score as you possibly can to balance that out.
Right. I agree with it, with what Clara's saying here. The MCAT is something that all applicants have in common. You know, applicants have different classes they took. They attended different schools with different grading standards. Even different professors in the same school have different grading standards. So it is a constant. It also correlates well to passage of step exams in USMLE. So it's pretty hard. And yeah, I know they do holistic review. So that's true. That's there, okay? But I don't think it means that you can blow off the MCAT. Okay.
Yes, very well said.
All right. Somebody, and I can't find the question right now, but I know I saw it before, asked if you have a good GPA and a good MCAT score, it was a very high GPA actually, and again, I can't find it at the moment. I have a really good GPA, good MCAT, is that enough to get accepted?
Well, you know, just like you were just saying, actually, with a holistic, like the admissions committees will take a holistic view of an application. So absolutely, it's great. You know, GPA and MCAT score are probably the two most important components of an application, but it's not a guarantee. So let's say you have a very high GPA and then your MCAT is extremely good. You're still going to need like, personal statements, preferably experience. You know, have you worked in a hospital or shadowed doctors? And then also, you know, there's the interview component.
Right.
Then schools have secondaries, so essays and etc. So you can't neglect any aspect of an application, but you definitely can feel a little bit more secure if the GPA and MCAT parts are very solid.
Exactly. Well said. Well said. I always say, and this is really for any graduate school application, that the foundation of a good application is simply showing you can handle the work. But it's not, it's necessary, it's also insufficient for acceptance. So I think Clara hit the nail on the head. You can apply with greater confidence if you have those stats, but you can't be guaranteed of acceptance. You can't be confident. Now, on the other end of the scale is Serb, who asks, what if you have a low GPA? Do you still have a chance to get into med school?
Yeah, good question. I hear that one often, and yes, you do. Now, of course, it depends on what you mean exactly by, you know, a low GPA. Of course, there are levels, you know, where if it's
There's low and
extremely
there's
low,
really low.
yeah, there's really low, and then, you know, of course, a med school might be nervous about that. But the truth is, like what Linda was saying, like some schools are harder than others. Some people take harder classes than others, and so you can certainly make up for a low GPA. And MCAT score is actually the best way to do that. So I used to get a lot of students who they weren't as comfortable with their GPA as they would have liked. And then I'd say, you know, you certainly want your MCAT to be, you know, at least a couple points higher than maybe you would want it to be if your GPA was extremely good. And the higher the MCAT, the better. Because if you're, again, like with the MCAT being a constant, if you get a very good MCAT score, it's covering the same material that you saw in college. So it's going to make admissions committees feel more comfortable that, oh, you do know that material. Maybe there was some extenuating circumstance or something like that, some reason behind your lower GPA.
Okay. Lots of good questions coming in. From Alice, what MCAT score is considered a good score?
Ooh, great question. So
Yeah.
I assume most of you probably are a little bit familiar with the scale, although not everyone, of course. So the MCAT is scored from 472 to 528, which is new. So it used to be a lot more kind of manageable low numbers. And so the median is 500. So if you score 500, then you're doing better than about 50% of people taking the test. And so it kind of depends on what your goals are, because a lot of times with people going to DO schools or specific programs, a score of 500, a little bit higher than 500 is fine. In general, if you're looking for, you know, say a U.S. medical school, then you're going to be wanting to look at scores like higher than 510. So, and I mean, ideally, like let's say you get a 515 plus, then you're very solid. You know, you
Yeah,
don't
for
have to worry
sure.
too much. Yeah, but yeah, 510 is usually the benchmark. And if you're familiar with the old exam, it's like kind of like 510 is the new like 31 or 32, basically, which were kind of like the safe. You know, no score is ever entirely safe, but that's what you would want to be looking at.
Okay. Fareha asks, for someone who is just starting the prep now and plans not to take it after 4 to 5 months, what resource would be the best starting point? Should I get a book first or try to go through the free resources such as Khan Academy free stuff at Next Step or what?
Yes, great question.
It is.
So I would, yeah, a lot of great questions tonight.
Yes, yes.
And so what I would advise is getting a set of content books. And of course, it depends on your budget. You can actually prep for the MCAT on a very low budget. Because Khan Academy, like you mentioned, has, a very large amount of free resources because they're the official partner of the AAMC. Now the problem with just using Khan Academy or just using these online free resources is I like having kind of a structure where I'm like, okay, I know I am seeing virtually everything that will be tested. And the best way to do that is with a set of prep books. So like Next Step has a set of content review books, and every other company does as well. And so that way you can say, okay, then you can start going through those books. You can supplement with Khan videos or other resources, but you really know, okay, once you've gone through these books and really understand everything in them, then you've seen 95 to like 98% of what's on the test. And then once you do that, then, and you can also use these free resources as you go too. And by the way, this is a little bit unrelated, but I definitely also advise when people prep for the test, don't leave practice tests too late. So don't try to get through 100% of this content book set before you even take a practice test. Try to take a practice test early, like within the first, say, month of your prep, so you get an idea of, oh, here's what the MCAT actually feels like.
Okay, great. I think we'll take one more question. We are running a little bit over, but they're good questions. Okay, Sarah asks, how many practice problems would I attempt to do, or I don't know if it's practice problems or practice tests, which you kind of just covered, should I take before taking the MCAT?
Yes, great. Yeah, so basically, yeah, people always kind of try to take the right number of practice tests. And so with practice tests, it's interesting. It varies. So I'd say most students preparing for the MCAT take between, say, 5 and 8 practice tests, because the AAMC, which are the official test makers, they have 3 practice tests right now. And pretty much anyone in test prep would advise students to take all 3, because, of course, if they're made by the official test makers and there's only 3 of them, you want to see what that exam is going to be like. And so probably 5 to 8 on average exams in total. But it also depends. So if you feel like you have a lot of like test anxiety, or if you have like endurance problems, like you get tired really easily, or if you have a lot of time, like say you're not taking your exam for like 6 months, certainly there are students who take maybe 10 or 12 practice tests. Now I would not advise going over that necessarily, because then I see a lot of students kind of run into this kind of view where it's like, oh, the more practice tests I take, the better. Like they want to take like 20 practice tests. And by far the most important thing about prep for the MCAT is reviewing. So you want to spend as much time reviewing each practice test as you did taking it, and preferably more. So that could be a day and a half or 2 days of review for each practice test. So taking 5 or 8 practice tests and reviewing them really carefully is infinitely better than taking more and trying to rush the review.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want to thank our guests all for their wonderful questions and their participation. I want to thank Clara for the fantastic webinar. Thank you both for your participation, different forms, but both welcome. Remember, we have a free guide for all webinar participants, Navigating the Med School Maze, 12 tips for getting in. And I'm going to retweet you the link. You can, it's a free download. It's a free guide. There you go. And you'll be all set. So you can grab that there. Again, mentioning that we have a webinar coming up in early December that will address some of the more holistic, the risk of using a somewhat abused term, med school application issues, not just the MCAT, and that will be on December 7th. We'll be emailing you when the registration page is available. Watch your email and acceptance blog for the announcement. As you leave, you're going to be asked to complete a short survey. Please do. Just takes a couple of minutes. We value your feedback, and we do make adjustments to these webinars based on your feedback. Many of you have asked about recordings for the webinar. We have recorded it, and it should be posted probably sometime next week. So again, we will email you when it's available. Thank you again. Thank you again to Clara. Thank you to the applicants who've come, and best of luck with the MCAT.
Thank you, Linda.
You're welcome.